Hello everybody, welcome. My name is Dr. Anthony Cliff, and today we're going to talk you through how to conduct interviews, whether that be face-to-face or online. I'm going to talk you through some of the principles, why do we do interviews, what type of interviews can you do, and then how to think about how you get your participants and impression management and that kind of stuff, which isn't often discussed in research. So those who don't know, I'm a senior lecturer in geography, and I've been conducting these in my own time now, these series of videos about how to do numerous things, be that SPSS and data analysis from questionnaires, how to set questionnaires up, right the way through to our qualitative stuff, how to use NVivo, and how to do stuff like this, making interviews. So please do subscribe, please do follow the links in the description and the videos that pop up throughout this series. So hopefully that helps you, whether you're a staff member or a student. So let's crack on then, let's get started. So the first thing you need to think of is why do we do interviews? Well, simply, interviews have moved away from the quantitative stance of viewing respondents as simple data towards a recognition that respondents can actually generate knowledge from conversation. And certainly Cavell in 1983, that's something that he was a real champion of. Interviews, they allow the respondent and the researcher to explore and discuss their interpretations of the real world and the phenomenon in question. Now, if you think about it, a quantitative stance is very much the fact that there is only one truth out there, and that's why you run big data, you would use questionnaires, you would run experiments to see if that one truth is found and if that's true. Now, if you're using interviews, you're probably more from the interpretivist paradigm, which is the recognition that everyone views the world differently than their fellow person because they've had different experiences, they've had different upbringings, different backgrounds, etc. So there's no one truth. The truth is relative to each individual person, and that's why you would do interviews. So, excuse me, so you gather data through direct verbal interaction between respondents, and like I say, this does differ between questionnaires because they're often very regimented and the respondent can only answer in one way. Interviews gives you that much better chance of getting that in-depth data because you can ask it in different ways. So, what are the 4 key points then for interviews? Well, you get to identify, so you can have some key aspect relation to your research question to either generate theory or a hypothesis. You get to review and update, so unlike a questionnaire, if you've given out your questionnaire and you notice some potential mistakes or some questions that aren't being answered correctly, you can't go and change that. But interviews allow research to be very reflexive, so you can review your data constantly and you can change the way you approach your questions depending on what the data is coming out and saying. Often you get very in-depth data, so you have a small number of participants, but you have very rich, very in-depth data, whereas a questionnaire, you may have a lot of data, but it might be quite superficial and quite broad. And for implementation, it's always fantastic to use interviews if you're implementing and investigating a project and its effectiveness. So that's often quite useful rather than a questionnaire. Okay, a questionnaire you can get a before and after, but you don't really get the meat on the bones which interviews can give you for that kind of study. So what are the different types of interviews? Well, you have structured, semi-structured and unstructured, and I'll talk you through each one of them as we go through. However, there are some things that you need to do as an effective interviewer. First and foremost, you need to be an excellent listener because obviously you're coming into people's lives, you're asking them about their life, you're asking them different questions. You've got to be the ability to actually listen to what they're saying. Now, people often say, oh, I am a good listener, but actually, how good are you? You're actually processing what they're saying. What goes hand in hand with that is being adaptable and thinking on their feet. Now, I've never done an interview where it's all gone completely smooth, everyone's answered the same question in the same order that I had planned to. Often they will say a question, they will answer a question that is way down on your list, and you've got to think, as well as you're listening and thinking, how am I going to then bring that back into conversation? How am I going to move stuff around? You've got to be adaptable. Now, every so often, you're going to get an interview, or an interviewee, I should say, who's going to throw a curveball at you that you don't you've not expected, you've not planned for. It could be an answer, it could be something that they tell you off the cuff. You've got to be adaptable. The best interviewers and interviewees are those who are approachable. Your goal as an interviewer is to make your participant feel as comfortable as possible and make sure that they feel that they can trust you because you're telling their story. You're going to interpret their story and you're going to tell the research community their version of their story. So if you're very standoffish and not very approachable, then they're going to give you one-word answers. So you need to be friendly. You need to make sure that you build rapport. And I'll discuss little ways to do that later on. And as I mentioned before, you've got to multitask because not only are you listening to what they're saying, you're also processing that. You're also thinking of next questions to do. It can be quite a challenge indeed. So the first one then is a structured interview. So what is a structured interview? So, well, they're predominantly used by quantitative researchers who are kind of dabbling in this qualitative method. So they're very similar to a questionnaire where it's very regimented. It's only asked in the same order, in the same way to each participant. And often they're kind of limited to yes-no questions in a way. So why would you use that? Well, it's easy for coding and comparison between your respondents, but there is a lot of limitations for this kind of method. So because it is very structured, the interview has to stick rigidly to the set of questions, and this can be confusing and awkward when during an interview a respondent will answer a question you've got further down the list, but you still have to ask that question even if they've answered it. And further to this, as an interviewer, you can't, if they say something, you can't then add an extra question in there to pull out more data that your participant might have said. So like I say, this is mostly for quantitative researchers who will employ this method. If you're going down the interview route, then I don't really recommend this because structured is very structured, it's very limiting, and it does kind of negate some of the benefits that interviews such as unstructured and semi-structured can offer you as an interviewer. The semi-structured interviews then, the most common. Why do we use them? It's only my favourite out of the three. So you want to gain qualitative but also quantitative data from a population. You want to gain some deep insights into phenomena, and you also want to find out the unknown that might not have occurred to the researcher. So a type of interview that is relatively open, but you also have a focused question framework. So it's in between the two really, of an unstructured and a structured. So you will have a set of questions that you want to ask, you'll have different themes, and you'll want to work through that list. But it gives you the benefit where you can move those questions around depending on what your interviewee is saying. So if they've said something and you find that really interesting, then you can bring in those set of questions relating to that as your next set of questions. And because you've got your key core questions listed, you can still ask those questions to make sure you get that data, but it doesn't really depend on what order you go in. So they're really useful for that because it does give you that freedom and flexibility to ask new questions as well. So not only have you got a set of questions, if your interviewee says something and you're like, oh, I've not thought about that, I've got a question on top of my head now based on what they've just said, you are allowed, through say structured interview style, to add that question in there based on what your respondent has said. So often this is where the whole idea of an interview comes about, because it does allow that two-way conversation to occur. It does create trust and improves the reliability of your results because you're gaining a deeper understanding of the topic, and also you're allowed, and the interviewee kind of feels like you're taking notice of them, because if they've said something and you then ask them a question, a follow-up question, they know that you're listening to them. So it's really good, and it's if you want to do some quantitative analysis on this as well, like how many times someone has said something and how many people of this question did they say that, you can do. It does allow you to do that. So a really, really useful technique. So yeah, it allows you to probe, and like I say, before you go through the interview, you have a set of questions, but it allows you to explore those in different ways. So what are the limitations? Well, say it's not all rosy. You need a robust and well-planned interview schedule. So because you know what questions you want to ask, you've got to make sure you've got them in the right order first and foremost. But obviously, other than that, you've got to be very attentive and adaptable, because it's unlikely that despite the best planning that you've done, that your interviewee is not going to follow that set of questions. They're going to say stuff that you're going to want to add in. They might well answer stuff that you've not anticipated beforehand. So you've got to be flexible in how you do that. But if you don't have a well, robust, planned interview schedule, and you've not planned for eventualities, then you're going to struggle in the interview. So say you've also got to make notes. You've got to formulate questions as you go along, which makes it a little bit harder. You've got to be often very careful with this approach to not generate extra data, or as I like to call them, is data dead ends. So your interviewee may say something, you may then ask them a question which takes you away from your core topic, and you've got to be careful that you bring yourself back into line, because it's very easy to do what everyone does on YouTube, where you enter a video and then before you realise you ended up about cats on the moon or something. So you've got to make sure that you bring your data back to that question. Otherwise you're wasting time, you're chatting to people, and then you might have 10 minutes worth of data which you've still got to transcribe, which is absolutely useless because it has nothing to do with your research question. So you've always got to be careful of that. As well, when you are thinking on your feet, so someone's just said something, you've got a question, because you've not written it down, you've not practiced it, you've not planned it, you could be asking it in a very leading and biased way. So you've got to be wary of that. Finally, we have the unstructured interview. So this is the complete opposite end of the scale, where you've got an idea of what you want to ask, but you've got no formal questions written down. You don't create any interview schedules, and basically you just go in there and you just start having a discussion. And if thoughts pop into your head, you go through and you ask those as you go through. So they're often employed when you're doing an ethnographic study. So an ethnographic study is when you as a researcher are studying a phenomenon or a person over a set number of days, months, weeks, could even be years. So they're often smaller interviews over a number period of time. It allows a story to be generated through genuine conversation and actions, because you're getting them to shape the data. You haven't got that top-down approach of how you think it should look. And you often generate a real vast amounts of detailed data over numerous interviews, from days to decades. Your limitations, well, they're only really effective for deep ethnographic research. Doing one unstructured interview is not really going to be good use at all. You're going to have to come back and do a couple of series of these over a numerous period of time. There's no direct plan or idea of where the research or what the researcher will be collected. So you don't know at the outset which way it's going to go. It could go in a completely different direction. And you've got a hell of a lot of data to go and sort through. So I mentioned the interview schedule there then. So what do I need by that? So an interview schedule is not when you're going to conduct your interviews, but instead what questions you're going to ask and in what order. So typically you'll group your questions into themes or logical groups, and often these will help you flow in your conversation. And then typically your first few questions will be about that person to build your rapport. And then also you'll have a point of comparison for other people as well. So what does one look like then? So this is an example of an interview schedule that I've created for research I've done in the past. So this is a reminder to yourself at the top to thank them for taking part, give them an approximate how long it's going to take them. What's the purpose of the research? Outline that. If you tell them to be open and honest. Make sure they're happy for it to be recorded, and then don't forget to introduce yourself as well. So typically on down the side, I'll have what's my main research question that I'm trying to cover, what's the central question that I need to be asked, what's the possible prompts. So for example here, who are they, and what's their journey been to get here. So you've got possible prompts here. So you could say, how's your term been so far? Can you tell me how long you've been in education, etc. Some possible prompts. then you've got to think of some possible follow-ups to those questions. So the reason I say to do this particular section is when you are in an interview and your mind is so full of processing their data and trying to think of stuff, you can take a little bit of load off your brain by already having some possible follow-ups to their questions because you've planned for it, and you can go ahead and use them. And then on the side you would then include your notes. Jot down any notes they might have said you find relevant about that particular question that they've said. So yeah, it's just to summarise that there. Your research question goes down on the left hand side. The next column is your key and central questions, and then you have some possible prompts as well. Again, some follow-up points and notes, and I often find it's very helpful to colour code those key sections as well, so that you'll know that you're moving on to a different section, or if your participant has talked about a different section in your first set of questions, you know you can flick back to your interview schedule and you can ask those set of questions and then go back to where you were. I say it looks something like this, a much bigger one. Here where you have all your set of questions, all your set of prompts, and you say they're colour coded as you go through. Again, here, different sets of questions, all go in here. Here's all your possible prompts. You want to plan as much as you can to take that load off your mind as you go through. So what about interview design then? So we're going to do that in our next video. So that should pop up now in the top right hand corner. We're going to talk through how to do effective interview design.